Everybody, my name is Sean Dietrich, but I want to introduce JD Flynn. He's a Drupal technical architect at Genuine Interactive, and he's here today to talk about erasing the stigma, mental illness in tech. Take it away.
Hello. Welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking part in this conversation. It's a pretty important thing to me. Like you said, I am JD Flynn. A lot of words there to say that I do Drupal at Genuine, and we're a full-service marketing agency, web development, really big in the Drupal community in Boston. I work out of Chicago. Great company. Can't say enough nice words, especially while being recorded. If you want to find me on Twitter, I'm at JD_does_dev. On all the Slacks, I go by Dorf. In case you didn't know, you're a DrupalCorn. If you want to tweet about it, hashtag DrupalCorn and hashtag Osme for anything about this talk. Has anybody heard of Osme? Okay. Usually one or two people, so I gave a brief rundown, but you might be asking, who the heck is this guy? Well, I've been doing Drupal and PHP for about 6 years now. Before that, I was doing HTML since the 90s. I started doing some BASIC around the same time. There used to be a show on PBS and a magazine called 321 Contact, and in the back of the magazine they would print out a BASIC program that you would copy verbatim into your BASIC screen and hope that you didn't mess up any typos. So it was a nice introduction to debugging, and it was really frustrating for a 10-year-old to go through, but it helped me learn a lot. I also helped organize MidCamp in Chicago, which definitely come to. It's not too far off, and we have a good time. Also a Drupal Chicago meetup organizer, so I do a lot of the things. And on top of all that, I was a paramedic, EMT, and firefighter for about 10 years before moving over into the Drupal web development. Also, I have mental illnesses. So I've got a few disclaimers that I like to say. For one, I'm not a doctor. I am not a mental health professional, and I'm not here to give any kind of mental health or medical advice. I'm just somebody with mental illnesses, plural, and I've had some difficulties in the workplace and in my personal life. So basically, I'm just here to tell my story, talking to us about us. I was in denial for a very long time, and also I tend to swear without thinking about it, so I don't mean to offend anybody. Sorry ahead of time. So there are a couple reasons I do this talk. Number one, it's because I want to start the conversation. People in general do not want to talk about mental illness. They don't want to bring it up. They don't want to open up about it. They don't even want to hear about it. It's got the stigma around it. People get frightened even being near somebody. I also want to share some resources and some statistics, some actual collected data. I've got quite a few experiences, both personal and professional, that I'd like to share. And because I've seen firsthand what untreated mental illness can do, both in myself and in patients I've cared for as a paramedic. Also, because it's a pretty big deal. In 2008, I know this was 10 years ago now, but it was the biggest economic burden of any health issue in the world. This is according to the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum. It was costing $2.5 trillion with a T dollars in 2010, and it's projected to cost $6 trillion by 2030, with 2/3 of these costs attributed to loss of work and disability. And of the 450 million people who suffer from mental health conditions, the majority, that's over 60% of these people, don't receive any form of care, and 90% of people in developing countries get no care whatsoever. But more than anything, it needs to be talked about. Conversation needs to be started. The stigma around mental illness needs to be erased. People need to get over it. And the first step to that is opening up the conversation. And you're all here, which is a great first step. So I appreciate it that you're all stepping up, taking the right steps. And even if you don't have mental illnesses yourself, you're here doing the right thing. So thank you. Thank you all for coming. So why should this be important to you? Well, I'm rounding up here a little bit, but approximately 20% of adults in the U.S. have some kind of mental illness or mental health issue in a given year. And we're going to find out a little bit later that that number is extremely higher in the tech community. So why is this important to me? As I said, I have mental illnesses, and for a very long time I was in denial. I suffered in silence, and I was afraid that admitting something, or admitting that I had an illness, admitting that there was something wrong with me would make it real. I was also a victim of the stigma. I thought that mental illness meant someone was damaged or defective, and I didn't want to be either of those. And it was kind of that thing where you're in perfect health until you go and see a doctor and they tell you that you're not anymore. There was absolutely nothing wrong with me, and then I saw a doctor and there was something wrong with me. I was concerned that if I told people how I was feeling that they would treat me differently. And there's a term called social distancing. It's distancing. It's a very fancy term for a very unfancy cycle. It's when people feel that an individual with mental illness is dangerous, which results in fear and isolation in the person with mental illness, and it's likely to lead to increased anxiety in that person because people are keeping their distance from him or her. And that's something that I often need to tell myself, and that many people have a hard time telling themselves. I'm not weak, I'm sick. So, I've been talking a little bit about me, and you're going to learn a lot more about me, and I want to learn a little about you. So how many of you are developers here to learn development, themers, designers, anything related directly to making sites? Pretty good selection, good. Anybody project managers, account owners, account managers, anything like that? Okay. Anybody in HR? Good. Are any of you in upper management, managers, presidents, CEOs, anything like that? Your hand's gone up a couple times. Are you kind of?
I'm kind of a mix.
All right. Okay, so a good mix of people in here. This is good. All right, so time to get uncomfortably personal and tell you more about me. I have major depression. I have anxiety. I have PTSD, and I have ADHD. One more, and I think I get bingo. I don't know what the free space is, though. So depression is marked by a depressed mood most of the day, and these are symptoms that are present every day for at least 2 weeks. There's a big difference between being sad and having actual depression, and that's something that a lot of people don't understand. Anxiety is characterized by feelings of worry or fear that are strong enough to interfere with one's daily activities. And again, that's ongoing. That's not just, well, I'm afraid of something. It's a long-term thing. PTSD is a failure to recover after experiencing or witnessing a terrifying event. That's according to the Mayo Clinic. As a firefighter, as a paramedic, and throughout my childhood, there were some things that stuck with me. And one psychologist that I saw made a very, very good analogy for me that really cleared things up to me. So we all work with computers. We understand what RAM is and what storage is, the difference between memory and storage, right? So the RAM is kind of the quick, it's right there, really easily accessible. Anything that you need to load up in there is just moving back and forth. And you've got your storage, your hard disk. A little bit farther back, it takes a little bit longer to get put into the RAM, moving back and forth. So think of those as your long-term memory and your short-term. Your long-term takes a little bit longer to get back and forth, but it's still there. Your short-term is everything's just ready. Really, really quick movement. When somebody has PTSD, an event gets stuck in the RAM. It gets stuck in the short-term memory, and anything even close to reminding a person of that event, sight, smell, sound, can just make them relive it as if they're in that event again. And part of treatment for that is finding a way to move the short-term memory back to the long-term memory and process it through. So to me, that made a lot of sense, the way he explained it. Hopefully it clears up any questions, or at least some questions that any of you may have had. But yeah, it definitely, that one really hit home for me, because it's the exact same thing, that there is stuff that needs to be processed. And finally, ADHD. It's characterized by varying degrees of hyperactivity, impulsivity, and or inattention that lead to difficulty in academic, emotional, and social functioning. I was only recently diagnosed with this. because when I was a kid, it was often just looked at as being a little, needing to burn off some energy, or just being a kid, or being imaginative, or being a bit odd. That was, nothing to be worried about. So I told you I had a hard time accepting something was wrong, and that's what changed. That's what got me diagnosed, got me treatment. It was the first thing that I did was the hardest, and that was admitting that there was a problem. And there's that trope that the first step is admitting you have a problem, and it's true. I saw other people living happy lives, not getting as upset about things as I did. People weren't going through the same things I was. I got really angry about small things very easily, and I noticed that people weren't affected by everyday things like me. And I kind of had an epiphany that maybe everybody else and everything else wasn't the issue. Maybe it was me. One of those things like, if everywhere you go smells like dog crap, maybe you should look at the bottom of your own shoe. And this was the hardest part. I couldn't admit that it was me that was a problem until I did, and I got treatment. Part of my treatment, I take medication. I am a huge proponent of better living through chemistry. I see a therapist. I find creative outlets. I'm in a couple of community bands, so one of the nerdiest things you might hear at a tech conference is that I play baritone saxophone in 2 community bands. I'm proud of it. I'm very active in my local Drupal community in Chicago, and then for some reason I bought a coffee shop. And that's a story for another time. I also start the conversation. I do stuff like this. I'm not shy about talking about it, and if people ask me questions, I won't hold back. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that people don't necessarily need to know the details of my PTSD, but I'm not afraid to talk about it. I'm not afraid to explain it. And the way I see it, if other people are uncomfortable about it, that's their problem. I don't mind talking openly about it. If somebody wants to talk to me about it, I'll listen. If somebody wants me to talk to them about it, I will. So what was it like before treatment? At least for me, it was difficult. I mentioned I have a few diagnoses there, and part of the depression is there would be deep, deep valleys that I just couldn't pull myself out of. It would lead me to feeling useless, not being able to accomplish anything, unable to function, just feeling sad about everything, like I would mess up anything that I would touch. That would lead me to being unable to focus, which would lead me to being constantly in fear of losing my job because I couldn't do any work, because I couldn't focus, because I was worried about losing my job. And that was the worst cycle of all of it. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was wrong with me. I was constantly afraid. I was afraid to see a therapist because I thought only crazy people saw therapists, and I know now how ignorant that sounds and how ignorant I was, and I apologize to my past self about, or scold my past self for being that way. I was absolutely paranoid about everything, worrying about losing my job, worrying about what would happen if I do something every day. Basically, my fight or flight system just was in overdrive, and I was having the same reaction to small things that people should be having when they were being attacked by a bear. Social situations were paralyzing, so that led me to canceling plans a lot, which led me to losing friends and back to the social isolation. I was forcing myself into it. So I was alone. I made myself alone. It was self-imposed isolation. I didn't see it that way. And I would always feel like people were looking at me for any type of flaws. Do I have something hanging in my beard? Is there a booger? Do I have a stain on my shirt? Anything. And one thing that I laugh at now, but the way I used to feel, I used to commute by train a lot. I live in Indiana. I work in Chicago. There's a train that goes between the South Shore line. So I would get on a pretty early stop. Nobody else on the train, be able to pick my seat, and then the next few stops would start filling up, and I'd hope, really, really hope that nobody would sit next to me, that I'd be able to have that extra room. And then by the last stop, nobody was sitting next to me, and that feeling immediately switched to, oh crap, what's wrong with me? Why is nobody sitting next to me? I'm smelling my pits, wondering maybe I smell bad, maybe I'm looking frightening. And it was just, again, looking back at how I was then versus now, It seems ridiculous, but it was logical to me. I was also angry. I was not a happy person, and anything, literally anything, could set me off. And this is partially a mix of a high-stress job, being on an ambulance, being in that kind of environment, and untreated anxiety and depression. That's not a good combination. And like many people in public service, I was way too proud to admit that something was wrong. And unlike too many people in public service, I sought treatment. And I know several people who did not seek treatment, who were going through some things, and I can count, well, it's higher than my fingers, of how many people from my past life as a paramedic who have either gone through attempting or gone through with suicide, which is highly unfortunate. It's one of those situations, physician heal thyself. We're untouchable because we're in public service. We have the uniforms and the sirens. Can't be anything wrong with us. Not true. I advise anybody feeling that way to definitely seek treatment. It's also very, very misunderstood. People would think that I was angry when I was really just terrified or trying not to screw up. I had the honor of standing up in a friend's wedding, and it was a big deal to me, and the only thing that I wanted to not do was screw up the day for him. And so at the reception, sitting at the party table, and I was just sitting as quietly as I could, please, nobody look at me. And apparently the nobody look at me face that I had was the same as I'm going to kill everybody in the room, because that's what another friend came up to me and said, hey, you might want to try to calm down because you look very angry. Which wasn't the case, and it's definitely not something that I wanted to hear. But now, I'm not ashamed of who I am. Before I wanted to hide because of who I am, what I have, but now I know it's just part of me. I'm not too proud to admit I need help anymore. Fortunately, the valleys aren't as deep. Not to say that I don't have bad days, that I don't have depressive episodes, but they are much more infrequent and much less severe. My anxiety has gone down, but it still comes up occasionally, and there will be days when I have the feeling of a bear chasing me when I'm supposed to just show up to work. But I'm sure that everybody has that occasionally. Since getting on the medication and seeing a therapist and talking through, sorry, I just got a new version of Docker is available notification. I'm going to skip this version. All right. So since I got on medication and started seeing a therapist, I've become much more comfortable in social situations, and that's pretty well evidenced by doing this and by working in a coffee shop with many, many customers, where I don't think I would have been able to handle that before. I'm still extremely introverted, so at the end of this weekend, I'm probably going to drive home and curl up into a ball for a few hours to try and recharge. But fortunately, I don't have nearly as many anxiety attacks or times when I'm extremely afraid of doing normal things. I'm not as afraid of losing my job because of being unable to focus, because I'm getting treatment for it. I also realized that Docker ruins everything. There we are, okay. We're not alone. Since getting diagnosed and erasing the stigma from myself, I've realized that I'm not alone. I realized I was afraid because of the way that people viewed me, and I don't feel that way anymore because of organizations like OSME. Now, I've mentioned OSME a couple times. It's a nonprofit started by Ed Finkler a few years ago. Stands for Open Sourcing Mental Illness. It's basically, the mission pretty much boils down to erasing the stigma around mental illness and opening up the conversation. We do speaking campaigns, which is kind of what I'm doing here. We do outreach. We have forums that I'll get to later, and we have a couple handbooks that I'll get to later. So a little bit more information on that down the line. So I've been talking about it for a while, but what exactly is mental illness? Well, it refers to, according to the Mayo Clinic, it refers to a wide range of mental health conditions. They're disorders that affect your mood, thinking, and behavior. Some examples include depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, eating disorders, and addictive behaviors. But why tech specifically? Why is it something that I bring to a tech conference as opposed to just going out and talking to anybody? It was suspected that there was a higher incidence of mental illness in the tech community, but there was no research done. There were sites, it used to be devpress.com. Did anybody ever go on that, or has anybody heard of that? So it's been absorbed by OSME, so now it's the OSME forums. There's kind of word of mouth, and that was a question of, is it more prominent in the tech community because people who work in the tech community are more likely to go onto an online forum? There was a lot of anecdotal evidence, but nothing real. Also, most of us, pretty high IQs. I'd say that we're all pretty smart in here. And studies have shown that increased incidence of mental illness, specifically anxiety and depression, happen in people with above average IQs. The studies suggest that intelligent people with hyper brains are more reactive to environmental stimulus, and that may predispose them to certain psychological disorders, as well as physiological conditions involving elevated sensory and altered immune and inflammatory responses. Basically saying that people who are smart are more susceptible. There's also imposter syndrome. Who's heard of that? Yeah. It's a feeling that you don't deserve to be doing what you're doing, and I suffer from that tremendously. I still don't quite know how to deal with it, but I'm on a Slack team it's a front-end developer Slack that's more of just developer Slack, and we have about 15,000 members. So I started up a mental health channel just for people to talk, to vent, and right off the bat, when I got a few hundred people joining that channel specifically to talk, that was a big sign that it's an interesting topic to some people. And then it became a real common thread, everybody saying, how are we dealing with imposter syndrome, what's going on here? So it's not just me, it's not just you, it's most of us. And it also has inability to take compliments. I cannot take a compliment at all. If somebody says something nice to me, I usually laugh and shrug. And the hardest thing for me is to actually say thank you. And even then I don't believe it, I'm just trying to be nice. All right. Been going for, whoa. Okay, I won't lean on that. Been going for a while about myself and like to get you all involved. So let's ask some more questions. Has anybody here taken a sick day? HR isn't here, you can all raise your hands. Have you ever told somebody with glasses or contacts to try looking harder? I see a lot of interesting facial expressions, which is great. That's exactly what I want. Have you ever told somebody in a wheelchair, get over it and walk?
Special circumstances.
Okay. We'll leave it at that. Have you ever told somebody with diabetes, high blood pressure, or heart condition stop taking their medicine, do it the natural way? Okay. Didn't think so. We see images like this. A nice picture before us, that's an antidepressant, and the Prozac is shit. No. This. I'm sure if you have Facebook or any kind of social media, you've seen something like this. Some self-proclaimed self-help guru is putting these up. And one of my favorites of all time. If you can't read the small one, the small print, it's you don't need antidepressants if you lift. They all say the same thing to me, and that is that you're not trying hard enough. And personally, I can vouch for the effects of medication. I would not be standing here right now if it wasn't for those pills I take every morning. But I do admit everybody is different, and what works for me may not work for the next person, so definitely I'm not, like I said, way back at the beginning, not a doctor, just telling you what works for me. Fortunately, we have our own memes. And if you can't read that, it says, if you can't make your own neurotransmitters, store-bought is fine. So, remember those questions from 2 minutes ago? What if people with physical health problems were treated the way people with mental health problems were treated? Well, if there's sound.
And I was like, yeah, right, man. Oh! Oh, man! Please don't complain. You'll ruin the vibe. Just... It's like you're not even trying to walk. Have you ever Dude, another insulin shot? Yeah, I kinda have to. Have you ever thought about dropping the pharmaceuticals and fighting this the natural way? My diabetes?
Enough is enough. It's a beautiful day, man. It's time to get up.
Dude, I just got eye surgery.
Yeah, like a week ago.
Well, it still hurts. Wow. Oh, ooh, I think your friend hurt himself. I know. Nah, you're fine.
So, how do we erase the stigma? Well, we need to be stronger than fear. And the way we do that is we start the conversation. And part of that is also listening. Conversation goes two ways. So, listen to people. And if somebody trusts you enough to talk about their mental health or their disability, listen to them. Let people know that they matter. And as somebody with a disability, hearing any kind of affirmation can do amazing things. Even being unable to take a compliment, hearing something nice can still help out a lot. When I was on the ambulance, a lot of transfers I would do would be for behavioral med, and it would be going from facilities that weren't outfitted to handle that kind of issue to other facilities. Or it could be, a patient having an episode or an issue at their house and needing to go to a psychiatric facility. But 9 times out of 10, getting them in the back, listening to them, listening to why they feel that way, what's going on, it would calm them down. It would get them to, yeah, you're right, I do need help. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking me in. And, there was, of course, always that 10th time, but the majority of the time, just listening. Hey, I'm here for you. That does amazing things. Don't be ashamed of who you are. And if you have mental illness, you have to realize it's really hard, but you have to realize that you're not damaged, you have a disease. Another thing is try to be respectful. You can't always tell who has a disability of any kind, so try to be respectful of what you say or how you portray things. And if you do feel that you have a disease, get treatment. Seek out a therapist, or if it's something more urgent, definitely get to a hospital. Now, I've been going on about personal stuff, but what about the workplace? I mean, we all need something to take back to our bosses, to take back to the office, say, to validate your time here. So, fortunately, we have data. Mental Health in Tech 2017 survey. OSME's been doing this survey for a while now. This year, the 2017 survey wasn't published as well as it should have been, so we didn't have nearly as many responses. I'll put up a link a little bit later on how to take the survey for the 2018, but the survey was made to several different communities, and all the responses are self-reported. So some of the questions are, would you bring up a physical health issue with a potential employer at an interview? Yes, 23%, maybe 40%, no, 37%. So when compared, would you bring up a mental health issue with a potential employer? Yes is only 5%, and no is 69%. That's almost twice as many are saying no. Another question. Does your employer provide resources to learn more about mental health issues and how to seek help? Now, this is not including insurance coverage. This is just, hey, we have a program, or here's where you can go. Pretty evenly distributed. No, I don't know, 27, definite no, 43. 29% said yes. Only 29% say with any certainty. Does your employer provide mental health benefits as part of healthcare coverage? And I believe that's part of the requirements of the insurance law. Yes, 56%, and then a lot is I don't know or not eligible for coverage. Now here's one that I took from the 2016 survey because it wasn't asked in the 2017, so I just carried over the data from there. Do you feel that being identified as a person with a mental health issue would hurt your career? I know the letters are small, but no, it has not, and no, I don't think it would, is only 12%. The majority is in the positive. I mean, 88% saying possibly or definitely. And this is something that I worry about every time I give this talk, but it's kind of freeing, honestly, knowing that all my cards are out on the table. And if any potential employers look up my name and listen to this talk, they'll hear what I have. And if they hire me, awesome. If they don't, they're lost. And again, from 2016, do you think discussing a health issue with your employer would have negative consequences? Put them side by side. Just a drastic change between yes in mental and yes in physical. People are definitely worried about talking about mental health issues. Excuse me. Now, have you been diagnosed with a mental health condition? Now, this is self-reported. We didn't, vet anybody's answers. The national average is around 20%. This is from 800 responses. Twice the national average, 42% of people who answered have been diagnosed. Do you think you have a mental health condition? So it includes the people who answered yes to being diagnosed. It's a little bit more, possibly is 19% of that, and don't know is 9%. So people, the majority of people in tech either do have or think they have a mental health condition. Now, as of 2015, 17.9% of all U.S. adults had some form of mental illness. That was 43.4 million adults. That's according to the National Institute of Mental Health. And all these charts, they lead me to one conclusion, and that's that we are afraid to talk about mental illness. And we're afraid because of the stigma associated with it. We're afraid that being honest, both to ourselves or to our employers, will have negative consequences. We're worried that coworkers will change their opinions of us if they find out that we have mental illness. They'll see us differently, treat us differently. And if you have anxiety, especially untreated, worrying what people think can really drive you up a wall. And thinking just the possibility that people are talking about you behind your back can just gnaw at you. And I don't know about you, but my mind tends to be very binary, so if it's not good, it's bad. It goes straight to the worst case scenario. At one job, I had an email about 2 or 3 days before my 90-day probation was up, saying we need to talk. And it was on a Friday. I said, we need to talk on Monday. And the entire weekend I was just worrying, okay, well, I'm updating my resume, sending those out, let's hope for the best. Just ended up being, hey, yeah, you've been around for a while, how do you think things are going? And just an innocent check-in. Then I had another job, my password incorrect, and I thought, if anybody's seen Office Space, I thought I was getting Milton, where they just kind of let me stay and do the work until I figured out not. So that's kind of the way that my mind goes. Neither of those were true, but the way I was thinking. We're afraid that we might get sent to the HR department. At one job, which kind of sparked this whole me wanting to do this talk and getting treatment, I told them, hey, I need a couple days off. They had an unlimited PTO policy, and I told them, hey, I need a couple days off because I've been diagnosed with depression, I can't function, just give me a few days to recharge. And immediately got hung up on, well, not hung up on, but okay, take what you need. And then 5 minutes later, I got a call from HR. I don't know how well you know your HR departments, but I was working remotely. This is somebody that I talked to when I was hired 18 months prior. And I hadn't talked to her since, and now all of a sudden she's dictating how I need to go about my day and plotting out everything for me. Basically, it took me a lot to tell my manager, my direct supervisor, I've got this issue. And then a complete stranger calls me up and says, hey, I hear you've got something going on. We need to talk about it. So that was a huge fear going forward with telling any other future employers. But why should a workplace care? Well, ignorance kills productivity, and it goes both ways. I was ignorant of how to get treatment, how to handle myself, so I spent days, weeks, I don't want to say falsifying my time card because I was sitting in front of a computer trying to do work, but I wasn't really outputting anything. So I was taking a lot more time than I should have. Before treatment, I'd have stretches where I wouldn't do anything except worry about how I'm going to accomplish things. Which, like I said before, would lead to the anxiety of not getting anything done, which led to the job insecurity. My manager didn't want to or didn't know how to handle it, and my HR department actually said, I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty close to verbatim, you didn't have to tell us what you had, just that you have a disability. And so they just didn't want to hear. They didn't want to have to deal with it. So, but what can we do? As I mentioned before, you can take the OSME survey, 2018 survey. It's osmehelp.org/research. It is about a 20-minute survey. It takes a bit of time. It's pretty in-depth. It's completely anonymous. We don't collect any data, any email, but every response helps us out. With that, we can fight ignorance with information. So, the survey helps us at OSME figure out where to push our resources. When I left that job where I had the issue, during the exit interview, I told them, hey, you kind of pushed me away by saying that you didn't care. Maybe you should go check out these handbooks that OSME has, and I'll give a link to those in a second. Also, for anybody in management or in HR, there is a thing called a mental health first aid class. It's great for that. It's not necessarily making you a therapist, but knowing how to handle, how to speak with people who may be going through a crisis. Also, we can take the OSME 2018 survey. It takes about 20 minutes. It's completely uninvasive, completely anonymous, and every answer helps us. We have the OSME handbooks, and I don't get a kickback from this. They're DRM free. It's $10, but there are 3 of them. They come in PDF format. It's mental health and tech, guidelines for mental wellness in the workplace, guidelines for executives in HR, and guidelines for employees. These are all based on the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and thoroughly vetted. They're great things for everybody, and like I said, DRM free. Seriously, take the OSME survey. It's takes about 20 minutes and doesn't collect any email address, and every answer helps out. Now, fortunately, we are in open source, and in open source, community is our greatest resource. I mean, we can look around. All of us here have something new to bring to the table. All of us have something to contribute, whether it be fixing a typo or writing entire modules. So we're very, very fortunate to be part of this. 43% of survey respondents claimed mental illness diagnosis. So what does that mean? We're not alone. And something that events like this help us learn is that we are more than usernames. We are actual people. We're not ones and zeros. We're actually here interacting. We're in bots. We're in lunch. We're talking, getting to know each other. We're also not damaged. Those of us with mental illness, we're not damaged, we're sick. And with a little work together, we can erase the stigma. Some resources available, osmehelp.org. If you're looking for a therapist, there's psychologytoday.com or 1-800-THERAPIST. Psychology Today actually does a Drupal site, so it's really helpful to look through that. National Association on Mental Illness and the Suicide Lifeline, if not for you, if for somebody else that might be going through a crisis, it's definitely available. So thank you all for listening, and if you have the time, cool QR code for a survey, not quite joined in, but something that I keep track of for myself. So does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
You mentioned that mental health Slack channel. Is that something that's open and available, or?
So it's the Slack team is a front-end developer team, and it's open. I think it's frontenddevelopers.org or something like that has an invite to the Slack team. I'm not going to lie, there's a lot of shit posting and just bull that you have to sift through, but there are some really good channels, and in addition, there are great channels on like JavaScript and front-end frameworks and just development in general. Some very great minds on there. Anybody else? Well, I've got nothing else. Got a little bit of time extra, so thank you, everybody.